in the thin, cold air of the Andean Altiplano, where villages cling to mountainsides like hardy moss, some stories are best left unspoken. They are tales whispered by grandmothers, of spirits that haunt the high passes and of families that disappear into the clouds, swallowed by the peaks themselves. For the people of Calicoto, the nearest town of any consequence, the Quispe family was one such story. They were a myth, a phantom clan said to inhabit a lost valley known only as La Cicatriz, the scar. Then, one day, the myth walked down from the mountain. Her name was Inez. She carried a baby, and with them she brought a history so dark it threatened to consume the very mountains that had hidden it for centuries. The story did not begin with her, but with an ancestor who lived in a different world. In 1782, Amaru Quispe was a man on the run, a participant in the failed rebellion of Tupac Amaru II against the Spanish crown. He was a marked man, a ghost with a price on his head. With his wife and 3 small children, he fled Cusco, pushing ever deeper into the Cordillera Vilcabamba, a jagged spine of granite and ice. He sought not just a hiding place, but an ending. He wanted to vanish from the map of the world, to find a place so inhospitable, so remote, that no army, no magistrate, no memory could ever reach him. He found it in a high, secluded valley, a deep gash in the earth protected on all sides by treacherous, glacier-carved cliffs. He named it La Cicatriz, for it was a wound in the landscape, and he intended it to be the final resting place of his own wounded lineage. Amaru Quispe's fear was a poison that seeped into the very soil of the valley. He established a doctrine born of trauma and paranoia. The outside world was a contagion, a source of betrayal and death. To survive, his family must remain pure, untouched, and unseen. He forbade any of his children from ever leaving the valley. When they came of age, they were to marry each other. His sons would take his daughters, and their children would do the same. This was not a suggestion. It was a sacred law, a covenant of survival. The bloodline would be preserved within the stone walls of their prison sanctuary, a perfect closed loop. He carved his laws onto a set of flat stones, a testament that would guide his descendants long after his own bones had turned to dust. The first and most important law was simple. The blood stays in the scar. For over 200 years, the covenant held. Generations were born, lived, and died within the confines of the 3-square-mile valley. The Quisps became masters of their isolated world, experts in cultivating high-altitude tubers and herding llamas, but their knowledge of the world beyond their peaks withered and died. The Spanish Empire fell, Peru became a republic, wars were fought, and technology remade civilization. To the Quisps, these events were less than rumors. They were the silent movements of stars, distant and irrelevant. Their reality was the punishing cycle of seasons, the word of the patriarch, and the ever-shrinking pool of their own genetics. The stone tablets of Amaru were their only scripture, his paranoia their only religion. The first crack in this sealed world appeared not with a bang, but with a weak, desperate cry. In the autumn of 2012, Inés Quispe gave birth to a son. He was her first child, her brother, and her nephew all at once. The baby was born with a skull shaped like a clover leaf and fingers fused together into fleshy mittens. He could not feed properly, and his breathing was a constant labored gasp. The women of the family, their faces etched with a familiar, weary resignation, knew the signs. This was one of the Ailu Kwaiwa, the twisted ones of the community. Such children rarely survived their first winter. They were wrapped in wool and buried in the small, stony plot of land behind the main dwelling, their passing marked only by the silent grief of their mothers. But something in Inés broke the cycle. Perhaps it was the particular helplessness in her son's eyes, or perhaps some dormant instinct for a world beyond the valley had finally awakened within her. She refused to accept the fate her ancestors had ordained. Under the cover of a moonless night, with the baby strapped to her chest in a worn manta cloth, she did the unthinkable. She broke the first law. She climbed out of La Cicatrice, navigating the treacherous goat paths her people had not used for 2 centuries. For 3 days she walked, fueled by a desperate, primal hope. She finally stumbled into the dusty outskirts of Calicoto and followed the sound of a sputtering generator to the town's small medical clinic. Dr. Mateo Vargas was a young physician from Lima. Serving his mandatory rural term, he was used to treating altitude sickness, farm injuries, and respiratory infections. He was not prepared for Inés Quispe. She stood before him like a figure from another time, her clothes homespun wool, her face etched with a fear so profound it seemed ancient. And then he saw the baby. He recognized the acrocephalosyndactyly, the fused digits and conical skull, as characteristic of Apert syndrome, a rare genetic disorder. But this was a particularly severe case, compounded by other deformities he couldn't immediately identify. The infant's facial features were disturbingly flattened, his eyes wide-set and bulging. It was a mosaic of congenital anomalies that screamed of a genetic catastrophe. As he gently examined the child, he asked Inés routine questions. The baby's father, who was he? Inés flinched as if struck. Her eyes darted towards the door, a cornered animal seeking escape. She mumbled something about him being a man from her village, a good man. When Dr. Vargas pressed for a name, for any kind of family medical history, she fell into a terrified silence. The only words she would offer were, "He is of the family." The phrase hung in the sterile air of the clinic, heavy with unspoken meaning. Dr. Vargas felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He had read about this in medical textbooks, case studies of isolated communities where consanguinity led to devastating genetic consequences. He had always considered them historical curiosities. Now, one was sitting in his examination room. He knew he had a professional and moral obligation. He made a call to the regional office of the Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Populations. The case was assigned to Elena Rojas, a social worker whose sharp eyes and unyielding demeanor belied a deep-seated compassion forged over 2 decades of work in the country's most forgotten corners. She drove the 5 hours from the provincial capital, her pickup truck kicking up dust on the unpaved mountain roads. She met with Dr. Vargas, who shared his findings and his grave suspicions. The physical evidence presented by the infant was compelling, but the true red flag for Elena was Inés herself. Her profound social isolation, her lack of basic knowledge about the world, and the palpable terror that radiated from her whenever the topic of her family was broached. Elena approached Inés not as an investigator, but as a lifeline. She sat with her for hours, speaking in a soft Quechua dialect, bringing her warm food and clean clothes for the baby. She did not ask about the father again. Instead, she asked about the llamas, the potatoes, the way the sun looked rising over the peaks of her home. Slowly, painstakingly, she built a fragile bridge of trust. Meanwhile, Dr. Vargas had, with Inés's hesitant permission, sent a blood sample from the infant to a specialized genetics lab in Lima. He requested a full genomic sequence, a test rarely performed for a clinic patient, but he marked the request with a single word: URGENT. While they waited for the results, Elena began her own investigation. She searched the civil registries in Calicoto and the surrounding districts. There was no record of an Inés Quispe. There were no birth certificates, no identification documents, no voting records for anyone with that surname from the high valleys. She then visited the local church, hoping to find baptismal records. The elderly priest, Father Miguel, had been in the parish for 50 years. He knew the local legends. "The Quisps," he said, his voice a low whisper. "They are not of this world, señorita. They are of the mountain. My grandfather used to say, they made a pact with the Apus, the mountain spirits, to be left alone." He led her to a dusty archive in the back of the church, where centuries of parish records were bound in decaying leather. After hours of searching, he found it. A single entry from 1781, recording the baptism of the 3 children of Amaru and Oclo Quispe, listed as newcomers residing in the high wilderness. After that date, the family vanished from all written history. They had become ghosts. Back at the clinic, Inés began to open up to Elena in small, fractured pieces. She spoke of her home, La Cicatriz, as both a paradise and a cage. She described a life of immense hardship and simple beauty. But threaded through her stories was a dark, confusing narrative of family roles. She referred to her mother as her sister. She called her uncle her grandfather. Her world was a place where family titles were fluid and interchangeable, a tangled web of relationships that defied all conventional understanding. She revealed that her baby was not the first to be born with such afflictions. Many were. Most did not live. "The mountain takes the weak ones," she said, her voice flat, repeating a phrase she had been taught her whole life. "It is the law of our ancestor." The scope of the horror was expanding with every conversation. Elena realized she was not dealing with a single case of incest, but a systemic, multi-generational institution of abuse, codified as tradition and enforced by isolation. Inés spoke of the current patriarch, her father, Mateo Quispe. He was the one who interpreted the stone laws of Amaru. He was the one who decided who would be paired with whom. It was a duty, he taught them, to keep the bloodline pure and the family safe from the sinful world below. Inés's journey down the mountain was not just an act of maternal desperation. It was an act of rebellion, a heresy against the founding principles of her entire civilization. Then, the call came from the genetics lab in Lima. Dr. Vargas listened, his face growing pale. The geneticist on the other end of the line was speaking in a tone of disbelief. The infant's genome showed an astonishing degree of homozygosity, long, continuous stretches of identical DNA inherited from both parents. This was far beyond what would be expected even from a cousin marriage. The genetic markers were unambiguous. The child's parents were first-degree relatives. They shared approximately 50% of their DNA. The lab could state with scientific certainty that the infant's father was either his mother's father or her full brother. When Dr. Vargas hung up the phone, the clinical suspicion had hardened into a grotesque, irrefutable fact. Elena knew she had to handle the next step with extreme care. Armed with the scientific proof, she sat with Inés. She didn't present the information as an accusation. She spoke about genetics in the simplest terms, explaining how families pass down traits, and how sometimes, when a family is very small and stays by itself for a very long time, sickness can become trapped in the blood. Inés listened, her eyes wide. The science, though foreign to her, resonated with the lived reality she had always known. The stillbirths, the sickly children, the physical ailments that plagued her family. Finally, Elena asked the question directly, her voice gentle but firm. Inez, the doctors need to know to help your son. Was the baby's father your father? The dam of silence that had held for 20 years finally broke. Inez collapsed into sobs, a storm of grief and guilt that seemed to shake the small clinic room. Through her tears, the full story poured out. Her father, Matteo, had chosen her when she turned 15. It was her turn, he had said. It was her duty to the family, to the memory of the great ancestor Amaru. Her own mother, who was also her father's half-sister, had stood by and watched, her face a mask of sorrowful acceptance. It was the way it had always been. Inez was not just a victim of a single monstrous act. She was the product of 10 generations of them. Her family tree was not a branching structure. It was a closed, suffocating circle. The most chilling revelation was yet to come. Her father was already preparing her younger sister, 13-year-old Suma, for her own pairing. The cycle was about to begin again. The information galvanized the regional authorities. This was no longer a social services case. It was a potential mass casualty event, a public health crisis, and a complex law enforcement challenge. A multi-agency task force was assembled, comprising police, medical teams, and child protective services. Their mission was to travel to the unmapped valley of La Cicatrice and intervene. Elena's primary concern was for the safety of the Quisp family members, who would likely view the intervention as an invasion, a fulfillment of their ancestors' dire prophecies about the outside world. Inez, now a crucial witness, provided a hand-drawn map of the treacherous path and a layout of the small settlement. The ascent to La Cicatrice was an arduous 2-day trek. The team was breathless in the thin air, a stark reminder of the extreme environment that had both protected and imprisoned the Quisp clan. As they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley, they saw it. It was a stark, desolate place. A cluster of stone and sod huts stood near a terraced plot of potato fields. A small herd of llamas grazed on the sparse ichu grass. It was a scene from another century. Their arrival was met with fear and hostility. Matteo Quispe, a gaunt man with unnervingly pale eyes, emerged from the largest hut, holding a rusted machete. He screamed at them in an archaic dialect of Quechua, calling them demons, defilers from the corrupt world below. Other family members, about 24 in total, huddled behind him. The physical toll of generations of inbreeding was immediately apparent. Many had visible skeletal deformities, craniofacial abnormalities, club feet, twisted spines. Some appeared to have significant cognitive impairments, their eyes vacant and confused. They were a people literally collapsing under the weight of their own DNA. The intervention was tense, but ultimately non-violent. Matteo was disarmed, his authority broken by the sheer number of outsiders. Elena and other Quechua-speaking officials moved carefully among the family members, explaining that they were there to help, that they were bringing medicine and food. The most heart-wrenching discovery was behind the settlement. Just as Inez had described, there was a small, barren plot of land overlooking the valley. It was dotted with dozens of small cairns, mounds of stones marking the graves of the infants who had not survived. It was a silent, chilling monument to the family's genetic legacy, a garden of lost children. The 27 members of the Quispe clan were evacuated from La Cicatrice. The journey down the mountain was a surreal procession. For the Quispes, it was an exodus from the only world they had ever known into a terrifying, alien landscape. The sight of the team's vehicles at the base camp caused panic. The children cried, and the adults stared in silent shock at the machines. They had never seen a wheel. They were transported to a regional hospital, where a dedicated wing was set up to house and evaluate them. The medical findings were catastrophic. A team of doctors and geneticists worked around the clock, cataloging a grim litany of inherited diseases. There were multiple cases of Apert syndrome, ectrodactyly, congenital heart defects, profound deafness, and a rare lysosomal storage disorder that led to progressive neurodegeneration. Nearly every member of the family had some form of serious genetic condition. Psychologically, they were adrift. They had no concept of money, government, or literacy. Their entire social and moral framework was built around the laws of Amaru and the authority of the patriarch. Now they were utterly lost. The legal ramifications were a quagmire. Matteo Quispe was charged with multiple counts of rape and abuse. His public defender argued that he was not a criminal in the conventional sense, but a product of a unique and deeply isolated cultural system. He was both perpetrator and victim, enforcing the same rules that had created him. The state also faced the challenge of what to do with the other family members. They were legally non-existent, without names or records in any official system. Granting them citizenship was the first step in a long, painful process of integration. The decision was made to separate the family units to break the cycle of abuse and dependency. It was a cruel necessity. The children were placed in specialized foster care and schools for those with developmental disabilities. The adults were moved to group homes and long-term care facilities where they could receive the medical treatment they desperately needed. The transition was agonizing. Some of the younger members, with intensive therapy and support, began to slowly adapt. They learned to read, to use a telephone, to navigate a world that had once been a terrifying abstraction. Others, especially the older ones, could never bridge the gap. They remained withdrawn, locked in a state of perpetual culture shock, forever mourning the loss of their stark and brutal home in the sky. 20 years passed. The story of the Quispe family of La Cicatriz became a footnote in the history of Peru, a sensational case study in medical journals and anthropology textbooks. It provided scientists with an unprecedented and tragic dataset on the effects of extreme, long-term human inbreeding, leading to the identification of several novel recessive gene mutations. The case also prompted a national effort to seek out and register other isolated communities, a push to ensure that no other family would ever again fall through the cracks of society so completely. Ines, now in her early 40s, lived a quiet life in a small town in the Sacred Valley. She worked as a cleaner at a local hotel, her movements slow and deliberate. She rarely spoke of her past. Her son, whom she had named Inti after the sun, had survived against all odds. He lived in a residential care facility, unable to walk or speak, but he would smile when she visited, a small, pure light in the shadow of his genetic inheritance. Inez had broken the covenant of her ancestor, and in doing so, had saved her family from itself. She had traded their prison sanctuary for a life of quiet sorrow in a world she would never fully understand, but a world where her children and their children would finally be free. The valley of La Cicatriz remains empty. The stone huts are slowly crumbling, their sod roofs collapsing, the potato terraces being reclaimed by wild ichu grass. The mountain winds whisper through the abandoned settlement, carrying no answers, only the echoes of a 200-year-old secret. The story of the Quisps serves as a haunting reminder that isolation, born from a desire for safety, can breed a darkness far more terrifying than any external threat. It is a testament to the devastating cost of a legacy built on fear and the profound, world-altering courage of a single mother who chose to walk into the light, carrying the future in her arms. The scar on the mountain is healing, but the memory of the blood that was kept there remains a permanent part of the land.